Good evening, everyone. It's with great pleasure that I introduce the Dean's Forum Lecture by Richard Weller. Richard is the Meyerson Chair of Urbanism and the Chair of Landscape Architecture at the University of Pennsylvania. He is also the co-director of the McHarg Center, the creative director of the international design journal LA+, and the former co-director of the design firm 413. Richard is a prolific author of 4 books, as well as a multitude of papers and book chapters defining the theory and practice of landscape architecture. He has over 30 years of practice, simultaneously as an academic and consultant on a large range of projects at multiple scales and levels of complexity. At Penn, he teaches history, theory, and upper-level design studios, and has been recognized by a National Australian Teaching Award and was voted as one of North America's most admired educators by Design Intelligence. Richard Weller understands the practice of landscape architecture at many scales. In the Anthropocene, how we respond to planetary scale questions is one of the great projects in our discipline. The tools of modernism have planned, constructed, and engineered a complex array of infrastructure, urbanization, and conservation that have advanced humanity with systemic effects that require new scales of practice. Richard's research and practice have helped shape landscape architecture's potency and highlight tools, methods, and theories to address the Anthropocene. His current work, The Atlas for the End of the World, identifies conflicts between urbanization and biodiversity through physical, climatic, and geologic metrics. The research pushes the boundary of the discipline to look beyond the agency of single interventions and stitches together a framework for what it means to practice at the scale of the planet. Please join me in welcoming Richard Weller.
Thank you. So you drop the lights. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's lovely to be here. What I'm going to do for you is provide you with a little bit of autobiographical context in the beginning of the lecture. Then I will move to some poetic references and some philosophical references to set the kind of background hum of the lecture. I will then show you a few back-of-the-envelope datascapes which give you an insight into the tensions being played out on a global scale vis-a-vis land use into the future of the 21st century. And then I will show you and explain to you what the Atlas for the End of the World is. As Brad mentioned, I've been doing this for more than 30 years. And the way I've been doing it is I've practiced, but I've always had a foot in the academy. I know people do it differently. People do practice very well, and there's very good academics that just work in the academy. My view has generally been that it's best if you can keep both academic work and practice in some kind of creative tension. And so by doing that, I've been fortunate enough to be highly selective about the work I do. I've been able to pick and choose projects because I haven't had to always pay the bills and run the practice as a kind of a service industry. And it's been my aim to be critical. I was extremely critical of landscape architecture from the outset as a student in the 1980s. The most interesting thing that happened in landscape architecture was that somebody put bagels in their front yard. And, you know, you had bagels on the one hand, which was a kind of belated, meaningless pop art reference decades after the same thing had been done in art circles. You had that on one hand, and then you had McHarg proselytizing about planetary stewardship on the other. And when I was first introduced to McHarg in the 80s as a student, we were given cards, punch cards, and we had to walk over to the geography department and put these things into the computer. And then the result was some kind of horrible, you know, amalgamation of mapping that was effectively meaningless. So I raced as fast as I could in the opposite direction. And I didn't like McHarg, and I didn't like planning because of the way, not because I've changed considerably now, and we'll talk about that momentarily, but it was the way the education at the time seemed so limited in terms of the art of landscape architecture and the instrumentality of landscape architecture. So I was extremely fired up about trying to do my own thing and challenge the boundaries of the discipline and the profession, for better or for worse. Now, I can put that into a timeline for you, just to be clear. At the end of the 1980s, I moved to Berlin because when the wall came down, I sensed an opportunity for designers, but also I had connections to the city. It's a long story. I moved to Berlin and I began doing a series of it was personal work or research based on the city and based particularly on the empty spaces that suddenly revealed themselves by virtue of the two Berlin walls coming down and that incredible strip of land, that fault line through the 20th century, no man's land, which ran all the way around West Berlin. Excuse me. So that became my research topic, as it were, and I asked simply the question, well, how can design deal with that space now? With a particular emphasis on the Potsdamer Platz, which became a 3 or 4 year story, and we know what happened there. There was all of the work that I was doing. It started with Berlin, it started with No Man's Land. The work that was published in this book, the first book I published, was published by John Dixon Hunt, which was an unlikely thing because John, of course, is the preeminent garden historian. And yet John, to his credit, I sent him a bunch of stuff and John appreciated ideas. And if there was anything about my work at the time, it was about ideas. I valued ideas above and beyond anything else. I wasn't interested in building. I'm still not particularly interested in building, although I have profound respect for it. And I was lucky enough to have a partner that was a master craftsman. So he was there working on the Swiss watches while I could think about the discipline and conceptual matters. This book was published in 2005, so there's a lag time, but the body of work is essentially the decade of the 90s leading up to the turn of the century. And it began with work in Berlin and it ended with the National Museum of Australia. After I returned to Australia, we won a competition. The National Museum of the nation, of course, is a project that is all about national identity. And that was designed, that was all hand-drawn, right? 1996 we designed the project. We don't have time to go into it. It would be a lecture unto itself. It's an interesting story. This particular garden, called the Garden of Australian Dreams, I'm proud to say became something that the government issued 2 reports on after it was constructed, saying that it must be bulldozed. They wanted to completely erase the project and the museum as well. So it was a very political project. It was extremely subversive at the time. And when I say hand-drawn, it's a surface that is modelled, and it was one of the first projects that tried to get away from Euclidean composition and geometry and model a surface and then pattern that surface. And the garden had a particular rule, which again was irritating for my colleagues in the profession, and that was that the garden should not in any way make reference to nature. It was not going to be a mimesis or in any way mimetic of of the natural landscape. So the only things that are referenced in this project are already representations in themselves, maps, paintings, certain texts, and so on and so forth. So it's essentially a panoply of simulacra. Then the red line represents a kind of a turn, and there's 2 things that happened here. Towards the turn of the century, and it was always there, bubbling away under the surface, was a suspicion that design at the scale of that kind of project, or design at the scale that the industry generally works at, which is mid-scale public space in rich cities, there was always a niggling sense that was, whilst it's important and good work, landscape architecture has been, renovating cities in the first world at least for the last 50 years, and we've mastered that art and craft and do it very well. But there was a sense that it was also limited. And so it raised the question of, well, what do? Do you draw a boundary around the profession and say, that's it? Like we know what dentists do, we can say, this is what landscape architects do. We do mid-scale public space. And that would be okay. I'm not saying there's anything necessarily wrong with that. But I had a sense that it was much more than that, which starts to go towards this Macargian, lingering, scaling up and dealing with more complex territory and being able to speak to power and influence power. So the turn was, of course, the emergence in North America of the discourse of landscape urbanism, which I shared with a few colleagues. And also there was a turn in Europe at the same time where the emphasis on critical regionalism and the poetics of design started to shift to, particularly through the Dutch, what some of the Dutch young practices were doing, MVRDV and so on, where they were using data in an extremely polemical and powerful way to generate projects at different scales. So things were changing, and I wanted to be part of the landscape urbanist discourse. I saw a great opportunity for landscape architecture there. To this day, I believe that the movement, if you could call it a movement, was empowering and is empowering for landscape architecture to fill the void of the city left by architecture's abnegation of urbanism and planning's abnegation of urbanism in terms of settlement patterns and form, apart from the CNU, of course, who are busy with suburbia, and that's a different story. And it's a pity that landscape urbanism is sort of being ignored now, and just because of the vicissitudes of design culture, and we lurch from fashion to fashion to fashion, and we lose things along the way. So I put it to you that landscape urbanism still has some merit or some importance for this century in terms of our professional and disciplinary reach. Anyway, the next book was Boomtown 2050, where effectively what I did was, abandon that kind of work, which had been quite an intense period, and the drawing that you see there shows a city with a current footprint of, from top to bottom, it's almost 100 miles. It's a sprawled city based on cars, and in the red area that you can see there are 1.5 million people. Now, the statistics for that city are that it will double its population by 2050. And the red land is built out, the blue land is land that's coming online, the black land is degraded agricultural land into which the city can sprawl. And the planning orthodoxy in the city, this is the city of Perth in Western Australia where I started a design school and was teaching, the planning culture in the city was effectively, they were always talking about infill and density, but they were effectively condoning sprawl. So I asked the research question as a landscape architect, can we take on the planning culture of an entire city and try to turn it around through design? So the book is essentially a documentation of modelling scenarios for alternative futures of that city. And it was an interesting exercise because it positioned me as a public figure as much as someone sitting in the studio generating ideas for... And so I became extremely engaged with the community, from school kids to, the political powers that be, very senior people that were influencing the shape of the city. So that was an interesting exercise. That then segued into an even larger, I'm not a megalomaniac, but it'll sound like that because I'm scaling up. And this is the thing about landscape architecture, and one of the questions I've always had. Can we scale up, and if so, what methods do you need to do that? And what is design's agency? Can design hold its ground, as it were, as you scale up? And this sets up a tension between design as an art and design as a form of planning. So the last book, which was published in 2013 before I moved across to Penn, looked at the whole nation of Australia, which is an extremely sensitive ecosystem, again, with a population that is destined to triple by century's end. And there is no plan for that. The same way here in the United States, you have no national plan for the growth that you will experience this century. So this book became a discourse on decentralised planning, getting incoming population, enticing incoming population through government investment and infrastructure to decentralise and for the nation to develop new cities. What you see there is from Brisbane, Sydney, Canberra down to Melbourne, the east coast of Australia, with 20 cities added of 1 million or so people threaded with the high-speed rail and so on. And so the book became a study on mega-regionalism and megaregions are fascinating entities in terms of the evolution of urbanism. My argument was that you could create megaregions by design, whereas the 40 or so that we have around the world now have happened more or less organically over time, sort of the same way cities have just morphed into one another, and as the infrastructure has been distributed across them. So that's the background. Now then the question, after a national scale, arriving at Penn became one of, well, can we work at a planetary scale without being absurd and without being, without hubris, let's say? Can you work at a planetary scale with modesty? And I think it's important to think globally. Globally, of course, suggests, a political and economic, geopolitical framework. So it's global in terms of the cultural situation, but it's also planetary in terms of Earth system science. And clearly, the future will be determined by the degree of synthesis between the geopolitical and the economic and the Earth system. So as a landscape architect, it seems like territory that we should be able to at least think about and discuss. And this is not a bid for power or control, but it is an attempt to use the tools that we have to gain some traction and have some influence, because the future of things is being decided by people who are nowhere near as nice as landscape architects, right? And landscape architects have been sort of bedeviled, if you like, by their own piety. And so I am interested in how we generate tools and techniques that can make an influence. So asking that question about work and method, scale and method leads to a fairly obvious answer, although it's not an answer, it's a literary genre, which is the atlas. And atlases, I note, have become very popular of late. And I'm happy to say that we did generate this atlas. We started this at the end of 2013, before atlases seemed to be bobbing up everywhere. And the project was, well, let's make an atlas, that gave us the genre with which to work. And then the question is, well, atlases are all about mapping. Let me go back to the first atlas that was produced. This is important in the sense that it creates a historical arc for the conceptual reach of this latest piece of work. The first atlas was produced by Abraham Ortelius from Antwerp in 1570, and it was called The Theatre of the World, Theatrum Orbis Terrarum. And the frontispiece kind of gives the game away. At the top you can see Europa sitting above everything, and on the left and right are Africa and Asia, and at the bottom you have the Americas with the decapitated head, the cannibals and the wild, the unknown. But the really unknown is this figure here symbolises virgin territory, terra incognita. And so in 1570, this is the map, the most empirical, accurate version ever produced. And this is, if you like, the reach of the European imagination. And you can see my country doesn't even exist, or at least it exists, it's much bigger than it actually is, but it is labelled incognito, it's not known. And what is also noteworthy this map marks the beginning of modernity, right? That's what it's laying testament to. And here we are 450 years later, and the atlas that we've produced, as I'll show you momentarily, is kind of raking over the remains to see what's left after this extraordinary 4.5 centuries of imperialism, colonisation and exploitation, based upon the dream that we could exploit the natural world and its indigenous peoples ad infinitum. And so this was produced, you see, 1 year after Mercator had enwrapped the globe in the grid. And the European imagination is just, in 1540, Copernicus has displaced us from the centre of the solar system. And So the displacement in the European imagination in a cosmological sense is replaced by virtue of perspective, our ability to navigate and sail over the horizon and make of the world what we will. In other words, we leave the Middle Ages of paradise, the Christian paradisical context, and sail towards utopia, for better or for worse. And so the research question, and this is a point for the students and others perhaps, but it's always about the question in many, the question, you can't answer these questions necessarily, but they're it's important to frame what you're doing with the right question. And in the broadest possible sense, the question we're asking here is, if maps let us into the crisis of modernity, can maps get us out? And that, again, that's a disciplinary question, because we make maps, we use maps, which is a question of representation. And I wanted to make just a brief comment about representation, because it's the way we come to know the world and then represent our ideas for changing that world. And certainly over the last 20 years, landscape, and this has been a critique of McHarg's empirical mapping, a reaction to that, but over the last 20 or 30 years, the project has essentially been one of deconstructing the authority of objectivist mapping. The expose that that's a false way of knowing the world. And I've believed in that, and I understand its value, but I also think it's been overrated. I think our insistence that the world can be transformed through representation is actually an art project dealt with best by artists. That's their business, and we need them for that. But designers working at a level of the representational, I think it hasn't been critiqued in a scholarly manner, and I think its claims the claims have been exaggerated for its efficacy. And I come from a school and have great respect for the authors of this work and the culture of this work. But as you'll see with the Atlas, we of course had the choice to deal with mapping in any way we wanted to, but we deliberately kept the maps absolutely empirical, absolutely factual, as if all our faith is in extremely reductive data. And that's not because we believe in it necessarily, but because it will get you in the door. It will get you a seat at the table. These kinds of images that we produce in design schools, beautiful as they are, and as much as I love them, they tend to alienate us from power, whilst they're staging a critique of power relations. So I think the mapping project, the contemporary mapping project, has to do with the digital, of course, but the digital is just a proxy for satellite imaging of the planet. What is fascinating about this is that we need to get our hands on these tools and use them in creative ways. But I think with this kind of mapping, we're getting close to breaking the great impasse of cartography, which was and is that a map is redundant the moment it's produced. I mean, it's out of date literally the moment it's produced, when it's a static map. So if it's just a three-dimensional mapping and doesn't involve the fourth dimension of time, your map is dead the moment you publish it, which is a problem for us in terms of the atlas that I will show you, but we recognise that problem. So I think with digital mapping becoming increasingly sophisticated through satellite systems, we're entering an age of ecological cartography, which will be not just locating things in space, but identifying how things change over time. You could, with a much more sophisticated platform than what we've produced, which after all is just a website, you could have an interactive, real-time mapping at a planetary scale. And so that, I think, is of interest. Now, I want to just turn briefly to the mindset. I said to you at the outset I would touch briefly on philosophy, but really this goes to a question of human identity in the Anthropocene. And I think we're living through a very interesting and anxious period about what we are and who we are, which is being generated by the obvious consequences of climate change. And if we go back to Ortelius's first atlas and read a quote from Mirandello, the oration, many of you will know this, the oration on the dignity of man, which kind of headlined the Renaissance, And this is God writing to us, speaking to us. I have placed you at the very centre of the world, so that from that vantage point you may, with greater ease, glance round about you on all that the world contains. I have made you a creature neither of heaven nor of earth, neither mortal nor immortal, in order that you may, as the free and proud shaper of your own being, fashion yourself in the form you may prefer. It will be in your power to descend to the lower, brutish forms of life, or you will be able, through your own decision, to rise again to the superior orders whose life is divine. So it preserves a medieval chain of being and positions us somewhere between the bestial and the angelic and the divine, right? But it opens the door to the horizon of through the agency of free will. God is now effectively condoning the modern project of us inventing our own identity, as opposed to cowering in the corner of the church and waiting for another life. And for better or for worse, that of course unleashes the power of modernity, of which this map is to which this map is testament. So, and I think it's interesting from where we are now with the anxiety surrounding the dawn of the Anthropocene to reflect back to the beginnings of modernity and obviously ask the question or start to build a picture of how our identity has been structured. Now, a similar quote from a contemporary historian, Yuval Harari, who's written a book, Homo Jewess, putting together, instead of Homo sapiens, he's putting splicing human beings with the divine, with God, intentionally. And he writes, some 500 years later, today we stand on the verge of becoming gods, poised to acquire not only eternal youth, but also the divine abilities of creation and destruction. Modernity par excellence. Self-made gods with only the laws of physics to keep us company, we are accountable to no one. We are consequently wreaking havoc on our fellow animals and the surrounding ecosystem, seeking little more than our own comfort and amusement, yet never finding satisfaction. Is there anything more dangerous than dissatisfied and irresponsible gods who don't know what they want? The figure here, I'll show you the artwork in a minute. This is a part of a fragment of an artwork by an Australian artist that I like very much, Sean Gladwell. And the figure, I think, relates in some ways to the ambivalent nature of the text. Again, the figure, you don't know if the figure is falling, the fall. You don't know if the figure is flying, flying being the kind of quintessential metaphor for modernity and power and liberation. You don't know if it's a real human being or a cyborg or a robotic figure by virtue of the, It also reminds us, I think, of Walter Benjamin. Some of you will know this reference. Walter Benjamin wrote a very, very powerful indictment of 20th century history when he described history as, the angel being blown backwards from paradise with its wings stuck backwards like this and being able to see nothing but an increasing pile of wreckage as we get blown ever backwards into the future. It's one of the most powerful and frightening descriptions of modernity, of course born of Benjamin's particular time and place with regard to early 20th century history. But the figure could be, there's something about that, at least for me. This is how I'm reading this figure, and I think it's helpful to construct things in this manner. It could also be Jesus Christ. It's a crucified figure. So there's a bit going on. It's actually this, which I like even more, because this is risk, and this is kind of exhilarating. This is, the rush of modernity. But again, it's frightening in the sense that the figure is appended. The figure has lost the typical anthropomorphic form and is now appended to the machine, the fossil, just exhausting the last bit of fossil fuel. The figure has no relationship to the landscape. And this is in Australia, that's a landscape full of indigenous spirit. The most archaic, deeply rooted connectivity with the earth is here. And yet the postmodern figure the figure of us now, the allegorical figure of us now, is just speeding through that landscape without any ability to deal with it. And yet it's also all about the horizon. We don't know if the figure is escaping the city, the apocalypse of the city of the Anthropocene, or if the figure is going somewhere new over the horizon. So it's full of mixed messages, but also the geometry of the way the artist has organised it is clearly, I think, and I have no authority here, but I'm just making this up, but I think is a reference to Leonardo's Vitruvian Man. So which is, you know, in symbolic terms, the beginning of the project of us, our pretense to becoming gods. So some of those themes that I've just, in a fairly clumsy manner, sketched out for you with those few slides and the reference to the artwork by Sean Gladwell, I think is being played out in the literature at the moment. And you could take there's many more books. I've just grabbed a few quite quickly, and you can scan across the titles. They amount to an expression of anxiety and confusion about our identity, questions about what that old stable referent now means. Nature is no longer something that can be venerated because we can change it. Nature is it's no longer possible to hold nature as some kind of pure other to us because we've now impacted certainly every square inch of the planet and indeed the atmosphere. This then questions what humanity is, which I think is a theological question and a philosophical question. It's an economical question, and ultimately this leads to design. This is what designers do. They have to interpret their times and try to make sense of it through the agency of design. And I can organise this for you. This is not a lecture, it's a but I can organise it, I hope, in a slightly helpful way. If we look at the grouping, the intellectual constellations that are occurring at this early phase of the Anthropocene, there are people that are accepting and trying to work with the fact that this is catastrophic. It has happened. It's not the apocalypse is going to happen, it has happened. We have fundamentally changed the workings of the Earth system. Now, as a species, we're more successful than ever. Biologically, we've colonised the planet with incredible success, but our success now appears potentially as our demise. So the catastrophic perspective is, therefore, that we need fundamental change. That's an interesting philosophical position, a revolutionary philosophical position based on a recognition of catastrophe, let's say. In the middle, I would put the eco-Marxists, which are the group of people that wish to place the blame for climate change and the Anthropocene squarely at the feet of neoliberal capital, right? They don't want this to be, we shouldn't get distracted by the philosophy and the poetics of this problem. We should be dealing, this is a socio-economic problem, and I think in many ways they're right. And then the eco-modernists at the other extreme are people that are, as I will show you momentarily, are a group of people who see in this the current crisis can only be met with creative ingenuity. In other words, the tools that we championed throughout modernity, the Enlightenment, rationality and individual creativity and so on, can now be used to broach the challenges of the Anthropocene. In other words, yes, the maps that got us into this crisis can get us out. Now, I think most landscape architects are actually eco-modernists, and many of them are closet eco-modernists. But so if we look at the distribution of approaches to this, you tend to get, on the one side, people that are recognising that this is now a complete rupture with history. This has never happened before. This is our Copernican revolution. We've changed the entire Earth system. That has never happened before. The alternative argument is, no, that's always been the case. We've always been modifying ecosystems. This is kind of normal. It's just at a different scale now. And they're both extremely loaded arguments because from those positions you can infer various degrees of socio-political change. So there's a lot at stake. And then if we bring this now to where we all work, design culture, you kind of have the old model of fortress conservation on the one hand, which is, save the animals and the plants while the ship goes down. Resilience in the middle, which is sort of like, you can keep hitting me, but I'll fight back. and geoengineering, which is a sort of a boyish approach to planetary restructuring. And all of, there's merit in all of these positions, but somewhere along this spectrum you need to, as landscape architects particularly, you need to kind of draw a line in the sand and start to say where you are philosophically and where your project is. What are you doing? How do you calibrate your project with regard to these emerging schools of thought? So for landscape architecture, we've actually been thinking about this for a long time. It's actually nothing new because McHarg, of course, wrote Design with Nature in '69, and he was quite clear. This is his role, steward of the biosphere. So there's no ambiguity in that. We have to take responsibility for the synthesis of cultural systems and ecological systems at a planetary scale. Now, alternatively, this is a beautiful quote from James Lovelock, who did more than anyone to bring a planetary scale of consciousness to the world through his research, through his theory of his Geoengineering theory. I'd sooner expect, he says, a goat to become a gardener than humans to become stewards of the earth. Incidentally, he does endorse stewardship. He refers to it more as, he doesn't use the term landscape architecture, he refers to he says we need planetary doctors to deal with this ailing body. So, to the eco-modernists, I want to just deal with them for a little while, which segues into some aspects of geoengineering before I show you the atlas. And this is classic North American optimism, In the midst of a crisis, there's always an opportunity. So listen to this. As scholars, scientists, campaigners and citizens, we write with the conviction that knowledge and technology applied with wisdom might allow for a good or even a great Anthropocene. Humanity has the opportunity to rewild and regreen the earth, even as developing countries achieve modern living standards and material poverty ends. So you can have your cake and eat it too. We must use our growing social, economic and technological powers to make life better for people, stabilise the climate and protect the natural world. It's everything. It's fantastic. It's the most utopian, optimistic statement that's come out of anyone's mouth for years. And so it's compelling. It's naive, but it's compelling. And I want to focus on this little bit of it, just with the next few slides. We need to stabilise the climate and protect the natural world. So how do we do that? When you Google geoengineering, you tend to get these kind of schoolish textbook-like diagrams which make organising planetary systems seem kind of simple. And these are all the tasks that we're going to attend to. We're going to grow lots of trees for carbon sequestration. I'll show you that in a minute. We can genetically engineer crops, green the deserts, seed the clouds. But the main idea that always rises in any cost estimate benefits analysis of geoengineering on a planetary scale is the stratospheric veil. It always comes through as the cheapest, minimal risk, although that's debatable, method of not solving the problem of climate change, because we're not dealing with cause here, we're dealing with symptom. But you could stabilise the temperature, which means the ice won't melt, which will buy us time. And we need time, perhaps. So I'm going to run a couple of back-of-the-envelope modelling tricks here, which I said I would, but I'm doing it by virtue of a future population of 10 billion people, okay? Which will be the population, for sure, by the end of this century. And they're not just any people. I'm going to show you the consequences of 10 billion American people. That means people on the planet that have an ecological footprint exactly like ours. And that's not just folly, because, and I'm not saying everyone wants to live like an American, of course not, but certainly you can see it's naive to think otherwise, that the global population aspires to lift itself out of material poverty. And in more cases than not, that manifests itself as what we know as an American way of life, with all of the fruits and trappings of modernity. So this is the dimension, and these are all accurate. There's Mount Everest. This is the annual output of carbon for a global population of 10 billion of us. Now, we need to deal with that in some way because that's an extraordinary amount that has to be handled, right? And so the stratospheric veil, which is indicated with this blue stripe through the image, as I said, comes through as the primary way of dealing with that. And I will just quickly give you the pros and cons of using this technology. I tend to think it's going to happen. I think it could be, whether it's regulated on a planetary scale through some form of new governance or not, I don't know, but I think it's probably going to happen, perhaps by force or by stealth. But anyway, here are the pros of doing this. First, it's a necessity. We have to stabilise the climate because we've got to prevent sea level rise. We need to stabilise temperature, which it could do. We could put stratospheric, or we could put the veil is simply sulfur particles. You just blow them out the back of an aeroplane, and they eventually rain down to Earth. So you've got a degree of, you can modulate it, but you could stabilise the temperature by a couple of degrees by putting some of this material into this at a stratospheric level. It would then prevent sea level rise, as I've said. It could enhance agriculture. Some people believe that there will be agricultural knock-on effects that could be productive. It will unite the world in terms of the geopolitics of dealing with climate change. And it's cheap and it can be adjusted. You could turn it up or turn it down as you see the consequences. Now, the argument against doing this is, firstly, of course, it's just a profound transgression of the natural order of things, which is, and this is interesting, we're okay with changing everything on the surface of the planet, but when you get up into the heavenly, when you get into the atmosphere, it's a different story. That somehow resonates with us as a different order of magnitude. It's going too far, right? It's the Tower of Babel all over again. It could induce an ice age, so you could flip, with positive feedback, you could flip the system. Bear in mind that nobody understands the system that we're tinkering with either. We can't even manage a river. I mean, we can't manage the flow of traffic in a city. So to manage something as complex as a planet is of course, frankly absurd. But we've never known what we do. We always do it, largely, and then we deal with the consequences. It'll reinforce the status quo. So if we can stabilise temperature, that basically condones, neoliberal capitalism as it is. Or alternatively, it might buy us time for us to change our systems, both economically and spiritually and in every way. It could alter the monsoon, which will have catastrophic effects for millions and millions of people in Asia, Southeast Asia and Central Asia. It's ungovernable. Like we can't agree. The 196 nations of the world can barely agree on anything. So how are we going to agree on controlling the temperature? And will all the weather events that occur, who will we blame? Who will ensure this? Everyone will be looking to blame this technology for good or bad weather. It's toxic and it's unpredictable. So there's a problem there. Now, if we come down to Earth, from the sky gods down to the Earth, you see the average carbon emission. This is what each one of us produces. And to sequester that carbon, you can see that what a tree, the average working tree, will only sequester so much over the course of a year. So if you want to sequester carbon, the excess carbon that we're talking about, the calculation is effectively that you'd need 10 trillion trees on a 3.6 metre, about a 10-foot centre. So imagine a 10-foot graticule, you need 10 trillion trees. When you work out exactly how much that is, it amounts to 88% of the world's terrestrial surface. So you could sequester the excess carbon, but you need 88% of the Earth's terrestrial surface. 33% of the planet's terrestrial surface is desert. So this means you're going to have to green the deserts, which means major ecosystem change, desalination plants to provide water, and so on. So that's a bizarre and frightening, but very interesting undertaking. The problem with that, of course, is if you use your terrestrial surface area for carbon sequestration, how are you going to produce food? If you want to feed 10 billion Americans, you need 140 million square kilometres of land, which is 93% of the world's terrestrial surface area. So at the end of this century, 10 billion people eating like we do, which just means eating whatever you want, whenever you want, and going to a supermarket and pretty much thinking you're buying whatever you want. If that became the norm for 10 billion people, we would, and according to today's current rates of yield and productivity, we need 93% of the planet. So we're going to have to farm the deserts anyway. That leaves a mere 7% for biodiversity, which is ostensibly a mountainous zoo on land we can't use for food production. Now, alternatively, of course, there'll be innovations with regard to food production, particularly if we can start to produce meat free of ruminants, then things change. The meat production is the big problem. If we can mass produce protein which is free of the actual animal, then that will be a major breakthrough in terms of global land use. And it opens onto this is contemporary Holland, high productivity landscape under glass houses. And so the landscapes of the future will surely look more like this as well in terms of intense production. Now, agriculture, so this is about land use on a global scale. Agriculture, carbon sequestration, the needs of those two over the course of the 21st century don't add up. But as well, you have the pressure of urbanisation. Now, we can at least expect another 3 billion people to move to cities and live in cities by the end of the century, which equates to 357 New York cities, which need to be constructed across the course of this century. So that's the historical period we know we're caught in, and it's a phenomenon occurring rapidly and on a global scale. And I think in the longer term, we need to push through it. I think it's ultimately beneficial in the sense that populations stabilise when they're urbanised. That's a fact. And so if you can urbanise for the rest of this century and reach a stable population living at relatively high densities, then there may be large tracts of land available for reforestation, assuming agricultural yield can also be increased it can have a smaller footprint. And forget about carbon sequestration, perhaps. So you've got agriculture and these other land uses coming at biodiversity, which is now my primary subject to show you the atlas, coming at biodiversity from one side, and then you've got urbanisation coming at it from the other. So we're in the midst of the 6th extinction. We know that, and that is going to continue to unfold across the course of the century. The question is, what do we get out of this century with? And this is not ecological moralising or anything. It's a question of genetic diversity. And that's not pandas. That's about genetic stock and the capacity of life's creativity to evolve. E.O. Wilson, the most famous advocate for a more biodiverse world, has recently argued that we should give aside 50% of the planet for biodiversity. We should back off. That does not add up with all the figures I've just shown you. So there's something way off here in terms of calculations. What is actually happening is that the 196 nations have agreed to protecting 17%, setting aside and protecting 17% of the world's terrestrial surface area by 2020. We're currently at 15.4%, and on this image of the globe, we've deleted or subtracted all land except that land that is protected. So you can just make out Africa here. Often criticised, incidentally, because this has been a land grab, by people in offices in Zurich running the World Conservation NGOs. This has been an extraordinary story of how they have accrued a global estate of 15.4% of the planet. The target for all the signatories to the convention, this is the Convention on Biological Diversity, is that by 2020, so in a year and a half or so, we need to get to 17%. So you think, well, that's not much, right? 15.4, it's 1.6%. It's nothing. It's actually a lot. When you map it out by, say, something that you know, Central Parks, it's nearly 700,000 Central Parks. So the research question for us became, well, where should that land be? And what's a method of approaching that question? If you put those central parks end to end, it's a ribbon that runs around the planet 70 times. And that's an incredible design tool. Because in the small print of the Convention on Biological Diversity, it doesn't just say you've got to get 17%. That 17% cannot be just a big forest in Siberia. It has to be representative and connected. They're the two key words. Representative means that you should have 17% of every ecoregion on the planet, of which there are more than 850, at a 17% level. And moreover, all the fragments of land that you protect should be connected, so the gene pool can migrate over time under the pressures of climate change. That is basically a recipe for global land use restructuring that is unprecedented, historically unprecedented, if we take it seriously, which many people are. So we've asked that question where, which leads to the project of the Atlas, although I've lost the fonts here, but that doesn't matter. Atlas for the End of the World is a kind of a spoof in many ways on the endism of the environmental movement over the last 50 years. And it very quickly leads to the subtext, well, Atlas for the beginning of the Anthropocene. So it's a terminus rather than another proclamation of the demise of all things. It's been done with Claire Hoke, Che Huang, Susanna Drodds, Nancy Dong and Zhao Renhe. All Penn students except the last person, Robert, runs a fantastic thing called the Institute of Critical Zoologists out of Singapore. And he's an artist that we involved in the project because he does beautiful, just a little sidetrack here, 2 slides. He does beautiful work, and I think his artwork gets to the pathos of the Anthropocene. And many artists are trying to do this now, but I think he's very good at it. This is an installation that he did recently, whereby the landform that you see there, this in a cabinet of curiosity, is in fact one tree, which he spent, months grinding a huge rainforest tree, grinding it down to its, almost atomic particles, which is, I think, an interesting thing to do. He also does photography, and the photographies are kind of fictions, whereby, for example, these animals, the rhinoceri, have been genetically re-engineered so they don't have the horns, which makes them of no value to poaching. So he does a lot of photography of stage situations like this where you're not sure if it's fiction or real science, and he's tinkered with the animal's genetic makeup and then creates these rather beautiful images. Anyway, so to the question of where should this land be, we followed a commonsensical approach, and also we followed what is consensus in the scientific community, and that is that the world's most valuable genetics, that is valuable in the sense that they are irreplaceable and utterly unique, are in the hotspots, of which there are 36. And it's also interesting, not just genetic diversity is in these parts of the world, but also cultural, linguistic diversity. These are just incredibly rich ecologies. And they are also, to be classified as a hotspot, these landscapes are also threatened. So they've reached the point of verging on extinction in terms of their diversity. So these, from a conservation perspective and an investment, geopolitical investment perspective, these become the priority areas. So we decided strategically to look at the land use in those areas and see how those areas are performing up against the 17% target. That's not to say we believe in the target, we just recognise its efficacy in terms of the geopolitics of conservation. It gives us an in to use the target. You can hang a research project off that target. As it happened, no one had done this because the UN is embarrassed by not meeting the targets, and so are individual nations. So we have concluded 21 out of 36 are falling way short of meeting the 17% target. That's at the hotspot scale, and they're labelled, the ones that do meet the target at the moment are in green, the ones that do not are in red. These are often violent places, they're corrupt and so on, so this is fraught territory. And when you break them down into their ecoregions, smaller units, there's 391 ecoregions that constitute this territory of the hotspots. 221 of them are falling way short of the 17% target. So this is what we did in the Atlas, was essentially an audit. It's not art, right? This is a just grunt work, day in, day out, doing the numbers and doing the GIS mapping to conduct a global audit. So what you get a map of each hotspot, which shows you the current protected area, and it shows you the shortfall. And it then discusses, and then we break it down into ecoregions. So the Atlantic forest on the coast of Brazil and Paraguay and so on, we break it down into its 15 ecoregions, and we map those. And again, we show you the shortfall, and we also show you the remnant habitat as a resource in each of those that could be protected or managed or restored in some way. This light green colour is the kind of weedy, feral territory that most countries have now. It's land that might have been grazed, but there's no animals there now. It's not agriculture, but it's not pristine ecology either. So, but that's the resource from which, if you want to reconstruct these ecosystems, you would have to work with. That's the resource base. And so quite methodically we go through all of those, and then we do another thing in the Atlas. We don't just look at land use at that larger regional scale, we look at how the cities in the hotspots and in the ecoregions are performing. And we identify conflict between the forecast growth of those cities and protected areas and remnant habitat. So that's a fairly simple method where we use Karen Sito's mapping from Yale for her 2030 forecasts for urban growth on a global scale, and we superimpose that with habitat, with land cover mapping and protected area mapping, and the ranges of threatened species. We did that for over 3,500 mammalian species that as a kind of a keystone indicator of habitat. And so these are very clearly very low. 1 pixel is 5 square kilometres. They're low resolution. But everywhere where you see yellow is an imminent conflict between biodiversity, endangered species, and urban growth. So it raises the question from a design perspective, from a planning perspective. These are territories we should work in. This is a guidebook for our profession in some ways. It expands our purview, because what we've also done is a desktop analysis of over 400 of these cities. There's almost no planning. There's almost no design intelligence being applied to this problem of cities sprawling directly into endangered species habitat. It's just happening under the radar. Now I can put it all back together again for you at the global scale. Every yellow dot you see there is a city of 300,000 or more people in a biodiversity hotspot that is demonstrably sprawling directly into endangered habitat. That's a calamity. It's an absolute calamity. And it's a crying shame because, as I said, we're not involved. So where we're at now with this work is we've boiled it down a little bit. We're going to a final level of resolution because those maps are very crude, and you can see here we've got now a sample set of 33 cities, which are what we're calling the hotspot capitals. They're the cities that are growing the fastest and are doing the most damage and have potentially our argument is these cities should form some kind of global alliance to share knowledge and start to conduct research in an organised manner about urban growth and biodiversity. So the mapping that we've done, this is now a higher level of resolution, of course, is for the 33, and we've just finished this set of maps, which show, so there's Sao Paulo, for example. Wherever you see red is basically where urban growth is in direct conflict to 2030. And I'll swing you through these very quickly. There's Los Angeles, which is in a hotspot. Houston, which is in a hotspot that comes right up through here and up into Philadelphia. Most people here don't even know they're in a hotspot, which incidentally is we don't care because we're not part of the United Nations, but in terms of reaching the 17%, we're at about 8%, I think, in this part of the world. Houston, Bogota, and so on. We go right through them. Santiago, Brasilia, Cape Town, Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, Lagos, Mecca, Tel Aviv, Isfahan, Tashkent, and you see the same phenomenon in every case. And in a way, they're beautiful maps, but they're a bloodbath. Sydney, and then Perth, which of course is the city that I have worked in and know a lot about. And to make this real, I'm concluding now. I know this has been a bit long, but I will just show you what this looks like from the air. If we get in a helicopter and go above that little bit of red conflict area that you see up there, this is what it actually looks like. Well, it should look like. That's what you see. So this is, obvious preferred product in terms of housing and just pushing into some of the world's most unique biodiversity. And so that earlier piece of research about that city was, of course, arguing that there are ways you can prevent this. Sprawl is not fait accompli. It's a cultural product. We can do differently. It's not just sprawl, of course, in planned cities. It's this other form of sprawl, which, again, requires different methods to negotiate in terms of directing it in one way or another to minimise negative impacts. And so, as I said, we're forming an alliance now. We're working with the Nature Conservancy, Stockholm Resilience Centre, the Helmholtz Centre, ICLAI and others to pull together a kind of consciousness of these hotspot cities and try to move to a new level of research. This has an educational consequence for landscape architecture. I just wanted to finish with this and one more slide, I think. All the little green dots you see here are schools, like this one and others, and it's obvious what's going on. They're all in the north. And the hotspots are the brown. The diamonds just mean members of IFLA, the International Federation of Landscape Architects. The green dots, you can basically conclude from that there is no educational intelligence, at least in the global south. So that's something for the profession going forward to worry itself about. These are studios we're doing at Penn, which at least I'm not trying to pin dots on the map and tell faculty where they should work, but we are trying to, generally, we're making a push into this territory. So back to the planet that we have at the moment with 15.4% protected, and I will leave you with a quote which is from Stuart Brand that gets back to this question of our identity. He's quite emphatic. Brand, of course, was responsible for lobbying for the first Earth image to be released publicly in the 60s. In the 60s, he wrote that we are gods and might as well get good at it. Now he says we have no choice, we have to get good at it, which to me is essentially the narrative of Margy stewardship. And how we now interpret that and work with that is, of course, up to us. If we were to take it literally, what it would mean, of course, is reconstructing the ravaged ecosystems on a planetary scale, which I think could be possible after we get through the 21st century, which will be one of continued exploitation and urbanisation and so on, as I've described. All I've done on this drawing, what we've done is we've turned on all the urbanisation. It's quite subtle, but all the urban infrastructure is there. All the riparian zones are reconstructed or revegetated, and the major protected areas are locked in with connectivity so the gene pool can migrate. So it's a kind of a different image of the planet. There's a planet of fragments, there's a planet of ecosystem restoration, and I don't want to leave you with a sort of cheesy, on a high note, as it were, but I do seriously believe that on a deep existential level for us, as gods that don't know what we want, to engage in planetary reconstruction at that scale would, I think, be profoundly rewarding on many levels. And so this is not just a pipe dream, it's actually happening. So this is the most optimistic map I could possibly present you with. These are all reconstruction and connectivity projects going on in the world today. Human beings are, as they are ravaging the planet, they are also literally reconstructing it. Community groups, NGOs and governments are trying to treat the planet as a garden, and I think that's profoundly optimistic. So that's all I have for you. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions. please. I know it's a lot of information. Yes.
So, Richard, it was really exciting to see the groups who are starting to work at this scale. They're all, and I'm thinking of the groups that might be collaborating, like the Nature Conservancy or the Stockholm Resilience Institute. No big organizations that have extremely deep pockets. And I know we're also potentially complicit in some of the problems, like the World Bank or the UN. So have you thought about trying to enlist those groups as well?
I haven't. I mean, you're suggesting that the money's just not going in this direction?
I'm just saying that there are groups that have a lot more money than the Nature Conservancy.
Right. Yeah, they actually move a lot of money, but you're right. I haven't. I don't know. I haven't spoken. They're the only people that I'm currently working with because they're sort of fellow travellers, and I mean they're leaders in this area. And my argument is, of course, you guys need design because they have no design in the mix. It's just science. But yeah, how do you? The question could be, of course, then how do you restructure, restore ecosystems on a grand scale economically? And I don't know. But we're waiting for the economist that will write that book, right? I mean, there's going to be two great books this century, I think. One will be theology that factors in environmental values. That's something, I think. And the second one would be an economic treatise that was able to reinvent economics with environmental factors. Yes, please.
Talk about an urban context. I'm curious of your opinion on suburbia, which is something so prevalent in America. It's on the class. How do we use that infrastructure and kind of embody the carbon that already exists in these areas?
How do you use the infrastructure of suburbia? Well, I think suburbia is quite easy to retrofit. That's one of its potential virtues is that there's it depends on the density. You've got to be a bit more specific about suburbia because there are different gradients of suburbia.
Say if I'm 30 miles outside of any major city.
Well, yeah, in North America, yeah. I mean, I think there's incredible potential for retrofitting those environments. And I don't know that the case, apart from the fact that they're dependent on fossil fuels and that there's a big infrastructure cost if you roll out the development front further, I don't know that the case has actually been won that they are ecologically so detrimental either. I mean, the case for or against sprawl, we can argue that a million ways. You know, the problem is when you get suburbia where the planners push for density because they want to restrict the sprawl balloon of the city, but they push the density higher so that you get no porous landscape spaces. You can't get an urban forest because a lot of suburbs over time become urban forests, even though that people might complain about the species mix and so on. They're still potentially, they might perform fairly well ecologically. Yes.
Richard, I really enjoyed seeing this because I saw you presented about 3 years ago and it's evolved tremendously since then. I really love this project because it reiterates the agency of mapping, which, as you say, we need to embrace and use.
Right.
I also like the fact that it allowed me to identify myself as a future Marxist. But in that vein, I was wondering if you could maybe think about this whole exercise of global mapping in terms of identifying and mobilizing and maybe suggesting connections between forms of human agency which might actually, like grassroots groups that might actually begin to liaise and sort of create forms of knowledge that would provide an alternative way of achieving the goals that you're talking about, so like Slum Dwellers International or something like that.
Right.
And sort of begin to identify them in relationship to these hotspots.
Right.
And also maybe juxtaposing that with what are the primary forms of danger, political and economic danger in each of these regions.
That's the second question. The last piece is about what's the political and danger in these areas, or what is the danger, what is the potential danger of the way we're approaching it?
No, I'm thinking from like an urban political ecology
Right.
perspective.
Yes.
actors,
Yes.
who are different,
Yep.
but they are of a particular kind of species. So could you begin to map those?
Right. I think that's a great point, and I wish I could do everything. And I couldn't agree more that you need, this at the moment is a very clunky kind of top-down, this is the United Nations view of the world, here's the target, and here's how you are or aren't performing. As I said, I don't pretend that it's anything more than an audit. And then I wrap it up in disciplinary terms for you guys, but if I'm talking to other people, it's just an audit. So I think the only way that those targets have any... I think you need a synergy between the very local, the radically local and specific. Because every time, as we all know, when it's site-specific, it's a totally different story. But I'm also concerned that those that are all for site specificity are kind of marvelling over, seeing the world in a grain of sand and marvelling over it while the world actually goes to shit. And, you know, it's the train wreck where you arrive and you pick up a little piece of something and it's amazing, oh, it's so interesting, but actually it's a train wreck. So I think you need top-down and you need bottom-up. It's the key is the synergy between those two things. Otherwise, the conservation movement is in trouble because they tend to barrel, they get caught up in deal-making, these big deals, and they don't necessarily have the sensitivity to tune their work to local conditions. But I think also people on the ground that are involved in radically local work could find benefit from some of this mapping because they can argue objectively that they want to we need to reach a target. If you can walk into a big meeting and embarrass somebody with the fact that they're not meeting a target, you have the potential of resources moving in that direction. And then if you're canny about it, if you're smart, you could marshal those resources to your radically local effect. The problem at the moment is all of the radically local projects tend to be fragmented at precisely a time that we need to stitch them together at a bigger scale. The plants and the animals don't care for small isolated projects right now. Yes.
So I guess this is the follow-up question is there a spin-off, is there a spin-off book or something in relation to strategies of scalability or tactics that happen, at the next scales in relation to this project? Or how would you imagine, because of what you started with, when you were talking about the discipline of landscape architecture,
Right.
If you were to reimagine the discipline of landscape
Right.
architecture as the follow-up to this project,
Right,
what would it look like?
Yep, that's great, and that's what I do worry about, and that's what the work we do. We need to do that. Yeah. And that's where we're now going. We need to demonstrate that if you parachute a landscape architect into this territory, they can spatialise and visualise and come up with strategies for how processes will unfold over time to affect that kind of change. And I believe landscape architects can do that. I think they have the requisite skills to do that. If they're embedded with interdisciplinary teams of other people who know those landscapes scientifically at least and anthropologically. So what we need is demonstration projects. You can't just identify sprawl on a map the way I've done. You've got to be able to go to a city and say, you know what, this is how you're developing, but you could do this. And here's why it would be in your best interest to do that. Or here are the costs and benefit and the pros and cons of doing that.
Yeah,
And that's design. The science community can't do that. All they can do is resist the city. They can't redirect it. But they've woken up to that now. They know they need us. They just don't trust us yet. Yes. Hi.
For the lecture. I think it's a really fantastic example of how a designer's methodology can address a larger problem. And I suppose as a follow-up to Isla's question, I imagine that as a part of your lecture, one thing that I appreciated was the way that you're speaking about how landscape architects can inject ourselves into a larger global conversation and to reach the movers and shakers who really have the power to put these projects in action. So how have you in this project, and how do you see landscape architects being able to reach that
At the moment, the way into this space is through the NGOs, because they've colonised it pretty well. They've been out there, and I wish I could tell you more, but I haven't. I don't know yet. We're just forming those relationships. My hope is that once you get studios embedded in these places, you can do a lot of good things quickly, and that you could get some traction. That's at least the feedback we're getting from Penn studios, but they're just studios like we all do. To do sustained work in some of this territory and unpack the actual complexity of all the forces at play requires well-funded research teams of designers collaborating with local communities and scientists to try and generate plausible designs and plans for the future of these cities and for land use at that larger scale. I mean, even connectivity, for example, is nothing new to landscape architecture. We've been talking about connectivity for years, right? I mean, there's an established culture of us producing greenways, and they tend to be mundane. They're not really part of design culture. It's a fairly routine kind of exercise to get from A to B. But when you start trying to thread connectivity through land use, which is industrial, agricultural, has all these other contingencies, it's incredibly complicated. And so my view is that requires design intelligence, which we have an abundance of. Beth.
Okay, so another question. It's not just design intelligence, it's spatial literacy that has scale to it. So thinking about, maybe it's something that you're already doing in the studios, but another project, another scale, which is what are the spatial types that we know work in suburbs or cities,
Right.
at these densities, on
Right.
these topographic structures with these critters.
Right.
Right? And that seems like it would also be, it would be between the site-specific problem of just, I love this place, and then which city to start with, and
Yep.
given that there's so many problems.
Yep. But that's not a question. I agree with what you just said. It sounds to me like a strategy.
And is that something that's happening yet in the studios, or have you started to talk about that?
We're doing it we're doing it in the studios at the moment, but only with regard to informal development. We haven't done that with a city that still has some semblance of central planning or a bureaucracy or a market that's an organised development market. We are doing a lot of it with regard. So we're in Costa Rica at the moment, trying to shuffle scale from what and do what you're talking about. At the moment, what we're pushing for with the group of people I mentioned and some others, and is to identify about 5 demonstration cities. I think we should just get on with it, right? I think we know this is happening. We know the hotspots are serious. Let's just get 5 cities and kind of call them up and start work. The scientists have a kind of different way of coming to these things. They want to be absolutely sure that the data is perfect, and I'm like, come on. By the time you work out the data, the world won't even be there. But we're trying to identify now a small group of cities and to then work with in the manner that you're talking about, which is demonstration projects that shuffle scale. Yes.
So I work in Nairobi, which is one of your hotspot cities.
Right.
And so I'm kind of curious about human factors, because it's a city that has incredible violence around land use.
Yep.
It has extraordinary fights over property rights.
Right.
I mean, they've had protected areas for elephants, and they've been chewing away at them through industrialization.
Yep.
So I am somewhere between a very negatively minded eco-Marxist.
Yep.
And so how do you, I look at your maps and say, yeah, they're beautiful, but I'm completely skeptical that there's any utility to them. So explain how they can be used.
The only utility at the moment.
Okay.
The only utility that it's only the utility that you have from whenever you identify any problem and where it's taking place. Now, that's certainly not to say that if we go to that red area on the map of Nairobi, we can go to work and we can all produce designs for it. That's certainly not to say that those designs will have any traction. What I do think I agree with you. I realise the world is chaotic and it's hopeless, but I think we've also, when I say design intelligence, I think design can be tuned to local conditions where it's not just the blunt instrument of protected areas. That's just, as I said, that's someone in Zurich, drawing a line on a map. Designers who are on the ground working with all the contingency of things tend to come up with, or have the potential to come up with strategies that are fully cognizant of local contingency. So that goes to a question of planning method. You can't use necessarily certain methods in Nairobi. It's got to be a different set of incentives, a different set of representations, a different set of relationships and constituents. I mean, it's...
Well, that's why.
Otherwise, what you're saying is, just to be clear, what you're actually saying is that this is the way things are, and this is what human beings do, and we can't do any better. So I'm not with you on that.
Well, that's why I think Jeremy's point about who you work with is super important. I mean, the hair on back of my neck went up when you pointed out 4 schools that all were in sub-Saharan Africa. That was it, and then you put your X's for Penn. It's like there's so many environmental sciences departments, agent groups that you can really network with. And what's interesting to me is the more radical actually might be, the better. The thing about the Nature Conservancy is they completely capitulated to the market system in all of their approaches. Maybe you need an Earth First type of
Right.
alliance.
Well, that's a big debate. I mean, I know where that's coming from, and no one's going to win that debate because this is the constant problem of how do you deal with capital. I mean, do you dance with the devil or not, and to what degree before you become the devil? I mean, it's just I know that there's a group, the Puritans see the conservation movement being corrupted by global capital. But the sort of neoliberal side of the conservation movement would argue that unless they do those deals, they'll win. They won't win anything. I don't know. There was another point you made that was really good I wanted to respond to. Oh, the map. I know the hair on the back of your neck was worrying me. It was those dots are just schools of landscape architecture.
Right, think more broadly.
Yeah, I agree. And we have got mapping that identifies all of the kind of NGO offices, which is a different register of engagement and infrastructure and capital. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone.